On November 11, 1918, Germany, after the end of the First World War, sent a request for an armistice from France. General Ferdinand Foch accepted this request on behalf of France. Later, when he read the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Foch declared that this was not peace, but a truce for 20 years. This quote was confirmed by Winston Churchill himself. And as we know, Foch was not mistaken. World War II was indeed a continuation of the First. However, when we look at everything that happened between the two conflicts, a logical question arises. How did Germany manage to recover so quickly from the defeat in the First World War? We will try to answer this question in the next couple of minutes, starting with a little-known fact. Who really claimed that in the First World War, Germany suffered more losses than France or Great Britain? On the day the First World War ended, November 11, 1918, the distance from the front line to Paris was a little over 200 kilometers, while to Berlin, about 1,900 kilometers. However, the subsequent events often forget the fact that Germany waged the entire war on the territory of other countries and in July 1918 completed a successful spring offensive. This was followed by an even more successful Allied offensive, but that's not the point. The main thing is that the destruction from the trench artillery warfare did not affect Germany. Let's remember those regions where the main battles of the First World War took place: Somme, Ypres, Verdun, Galicia, Jutland, Marne, Soissons. None of the regions listed was in Germany. Germany could have been defeated in the war, but this does not mean that its territories were destroyed and it was in ruins. German territories were largely untouched. The aviation of that time could not carry out deep air raids over Germany in regions such as the Rhineland, Silesia, and many other industrialized areas. Almost not a single speck of dust fell on these territories. However, the situation in French industry was different. Already by 1914, Germany controlled about 40% of France's industrial resources thanks to blockades and economic restrictions. Despite problems with resources and food, at the time of 1918, factories in France continued to work, and people, being in an economic crisis, were ready to work for low wages. Therefore, the question of the restoration of Germany after the First World War must be clearly distinguished and understood that the conflict itself caused much less damage to the country than to France. Problems arose mainly due to the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles. You have probably heard that the Treaty of Versailles turned out to be ambiguous and subsequently contributed to the revival of German revanchism and then the Second World War. However, one should not blame too much the people who drafted this treaty. In 1945, everything was much simpler and clearer. Germany was in ruins, and the Allies actually entered Berlin. However, in 1918, if you asked an alien, he would not understand who lost the war in the first place and how to solve the problem of damages in this case. On the one hand, France, the US, and Britain wanted to tear Germany apart and impose debts on it for 500 years ahead. However, who will pay these debts in a devastated country? If too many reparations were taken from Germany, they simply would not be able to pay them. And if too much was left, a paradoxical situation would arise when the loser feels better than the winner. In addition, the US provided loans to Britain and France, which led to the fact that virtually all German reparations had to go overseas. All the problems of the Treaty of Versailles flowed from this. Finding a balance was difficult, and it was the first version of the treaty that did Germany the most damage. This led to hyperinflation, which we talked about in another video, large-scale strikes by Germans who did not want to work for France for free, and political instability. If we consider the period before 1924, then the situation was such that Germany, in order to avoid default, reduced payments. However, France responded with threats and in January 1923 even occupied 7% of the country's territory. The question of who is to blame is a separate topic, but the fact remains indisputable. Payments under the Treaty of Versailles were delayed, and more people realized that this could end in a new war or bankruptcy of Germany. France tried to make up for the situation by demanding the annexation of territories in Germany, such as the Saar and the Rhineland, and placing these territories under external administration. However, the US and UK realized that this would only lead to a guerrilla movement, and they resisted these demands. The only buffer zone was created only on the eastern border with Poland, which received some German territories. However, the situation was not ideal here either, since the absence of a common border between Germany and the USSR prompted both countries to cooperate, reducing tension between them and even uniting against a common rival. However, the main catalyst for the recovery of the German economy was the Dawes Plan. On September 1, 1924, the United States and Great Britain finally resolved the issue of German indemnities and rebuilt the payment system, bringing it into line with the possibilities of the German economy, which was then the Weimar Republic. In addition, they were given loans for development. As a result, the German economy skyrocketed. In 1923, industrial output was 55% of the 1913 level, and in 1927 it reached 122%. The unemployment rate fell to almost zero. The country's GDP grew at high double digits. Despite the loss of territory in 1928, Germany's incomes were a quarter higher than pre-war levels, and the economy grew faster than France and Britain. Returning to the question of the USSR, in 1922 the Arapil Treaty was concluded between the Soviet Union and the Weimar Republic, according to which the countries made concessions to each other in order to normalize relations. Debts were forgiven, enterprises were nationalized, and so on. This treaty, of course, became an important moment for the USSR and Germany after the war, since it was the first equal and human international treaty. This gave an impetus to both the economy and the self-consciousness of the inhabitants of both countries. In general, economically Germany returned to the European level by the end of the 1920s, mainly due to loans from the United States. However, when the Great Depression began in America, the Germans suffered even more than anyone else. GDP collapsed, incomes fell, and of course, the fragile political stability in the country was disrupted. This opened the way for the coming to power of an Austrian artist, who is often credited with all the merits for the restoration of the country. In fact, the Weimar Republic contributed 80% of the foundation, and the remaining 20% can be attributed to Keynesian policies and old government debt. Between 1933 and 1939, the government's total revenues were 62 billion marks, while expenditures amounted to 101 billion marks. The budget had a significant deficit, but few paid attention to it. Hitler openly declared that they would solve this problem by conquering new territories. Thus, the economy was much more interesting than the problem of the army, people, and technology. Unlike money, an army could not simply be printed, and although the terms of the Treaty of Versailles limited the quantity and quality of German armaments, in practice the dismissed officers continued to perform their duties, but in positions that were essentially civilian. In 1923, 10 years before Hitler came to power, the Aviation Inspectorate was established. Her task was to ensure that military pilots received their training in sports and civilian schools, where they could fly passenger aircraft instead of military ones. However, by the end of 1923, Fokker-D fighters were purchased in Holland, on which the pilots ran in secret. Since the beginning of 1924, cooperation with the USSR began, and German military pilots flew to Lipetsk as tourists, where a secret aviation school was built using these same Fokker-Ds and later German-made aircraft. Similar secret schools were created in the USSR for German tankers in Kazan, Chemniki, and Volsk. However, their importance is often exaggerated. For example, only about 220 German pilots graduate from the Lipetsk Aviation School, while there were more than 2,000 at the secret school of Braunschweig in Germany. In general, it can be said that the basis for the creation of the Wehrmacht in 1939 wasn't officially laid in Germany itself. That is why, when Hitler came to power and military cooperation with the USSR ceased, Germany almost did not feel any special changes, since the foundations for the army were laid during the Weimar Republic. For example, in 1930, Walter Dornberger was ordered to develop a liquid fuel rocket, and his drawings later turned into the military too. The civil airline Lufthansa was documented to have suffered significant losses and logically should have been shut down by the government. However, this did not happen in practice because the Lufthansa used civilian aircraft to train future Luftwaffe pilots. For example, Guider Guderian, the creator of the Blitzkrieg tactics, was one of the most successful officers of the Wehrmacht and honed tank wedge tactics as early as 1919 on the border with Poland, using trucks, and for the first time got behind the wheel of a tank. In general, the process of militarization increased during the most peaceful periods of the Weimar Republic, without even slowing down. Moreover, many believe that the lack of secrecy and lack of technology prompted German generals and engineers to look for original methods of warfare, which ultimately led to the development of Blitzkrieg tactics. Karl von Ossietzky, a German journalist, published a series of articles in 1931 exposing the covert militarization of Germany, and for this he was persecuted both by the Weimar Republic and by the Nazi regime. As a result, Karl was sent to a concentration camp in 1933, and his life after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1935 did not become easier. Von Ossietzky died in 1938, and almost 5 years before that, in 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, officially announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, and completely abolished the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Further, as already mentioned, there was a total militarization of the economy, with the attraction of borrowed funds and a budget deficit, which was planned to be corrected through the war. This is how Germany recovered after the First World War. First, a strange Treaty of Versailles was concluded, full of contradictions and the inability of the Allies to agree normally. And then Germany became loyal and accepted the Dawes Plan. But Hitler came to power and took advantage of everything ready, directing the economy to a military path. In conclusion, it is worth noting that even in 1939 France and Britain were industrially superior to Germany, and the reasons for the surrender of France are a separate story that can be considered in a separate video.